Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. The Ouija board said to look online. What we found on the dark web was worse than a haunting. Okay, I have no idea how to even begin this, but I need to get it out. You know those moments where everything starts off harmless, just some dumb fun with friends, but then it gets way too real? That's basically what happened to me. And now? I can't sleep. I can't stop thinking about it. I feel like someone, or something, is watching me. But I'll start from the beginning. So this whole thing kicks off one night when me and two friends, Max and Rachel, are hanging out at my place. We were bored out of our minds, scrolling through Netflix, YouTube, the usual. Max, being the kind of dude that always wants to stir things up, suddenly says, "Hey, let's mess around with a Ouija board." At first, we laughed it off. None of us were exactly believers in that kind of stuff, you know. But Rachel mentioned she had one buried in her closet somewhere, so she ran home to grab it. Looking back now, I wish we'd just stuck with watching trashy horror movies instead of messing with something we didn't understand. But of course, we didn't. So about 30 minutes later, Rachel comes back with this old, beat-up Ouija board. It looked ancient, like something her grandma had kept tucked away. The cardboard was faded and soft at the edges, and the plastic planchette was cloudy and scratched up. It smelled like an attic. If I wasn't so used to Rachel collecting weird stuff, I would have told her to burn it on the spot. We lit a couple candles because we thought, why not make it extra spooky? Max killed the lights, and we all sat around my coffee table like a bunch of idiots about to summon some spirits. You know, just teenagers doing dumb things for a thrill. At first, it was all jokes. Max kept moving the planchette on purpose, spelling out butts and Demon King. Rachel rolled her eyes and told him to stop being a moron. But then, the thing actually moved. On its own. At first I thought maybe Rachel or Max was messing with me. But they swore up and down they weren't, and honestly, they looked just as freaked out as I was. I remember the room felt off. The air got heavy, and it was like all the background noises, cars driving by, my noisy fridge, the wind outside, just disappeared. It was like we were in a vacuum or something. Rachel asked, "Is there a spirit here?" The planchette slid slowly to YES. Now I was still skeptical. I thought maybe one of them was just barely nudging it. You know, ideomotor effect and all that. I even laughed a little to keep myself from getting creeped out. But then Rachel asked the spirit what it wanted. The planchette moved again, but this time it wasn't slow. It spelled out, "Look online." We all stared at the board, confused. Rachel tilted her head, biting her lip like she was trying to figure it out. Max leaned back and let out this awkward laugh. "What? Are we talking to a ghost who's into memes or something?" he joked. But there was this weird vibe that hung in the air. Like, this wasn't just a prank. "Look online," Rachel repeated. "What the hell does that mean?" Now, a smarter person probably would have stopped right there, just blown out the candles, put the board away, and never thought about it again. But Max, being the chaos-loving idiot he is, took it as a challenge. "What if it means the dark web?" he said, grinning like it was the best idea ever. I laughed nervously, hoping he was joking. "Dude, come on. You don't just go on the dark web. That's how people get hacked or, like, stalked." But Max wasn't joking. He was dead serious. "You guys ever heard of the hidden wiki?" he asked, pulling his phone out of his hoodie pocket. I could already feel that sinking feeling in my stomach. If you don't know what the hidden wiki is, consider yourself lucky. It's this collection of dark web links that lead to all kinds of shady crap. Some of it is fake, but some of it is definitely not. You can't get to it with Google. You need Tor or some other browser that lets you access the sketchier parts of the internet. "Bro, stop," I told Max. "Seriously, that's a bad idea." But Max just grinned at me and said, "Look online, remember." The ghost said so. At this point, I was feeling uneasy, but I didn't want to be the buzzkill. Rachel looked just as uncomfortable as I was, but Max was already too far gone. He pulled his laptop from his backpack, booted it up, and started downloading the Tor browser. The vibe in the room shifted again, like a temperature drop, but not exactly cold. It felt wrong, but Max didn't care. He was on a mission. Within minutes, he was on Tor, scrolling through the hidden wiki. Most of the links were your typical dark web stuff, Bitcoin scams, shady marketplaces, and a bunch of weird forums. But then Max found something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The link was just called The Answer. "What do you think that is?" Max whispered, his excitement clear. Rachel shook her head. "I don't know." Maybe we shouldn't click on it. But Max, being Max, didn't even hesitate. He clicked the link, and the screen went black for a second before loading this plain white page with a single question at the top. "What are you searching for?" Max typed ghosts into the search bar, trying to be funny. But the page refreshed instantly, and now there was a new message waiting for us. "You're not looking hard enough." The three of us just sat there, staring at the screen. I remember feeling like my stomach had dropped into my feet. It was just too specific, like it knew we weren't messing around anymore. Max leaned closer to the screen and typed, "Who are you?" The response came back immediately. "You already invited me." Rachel gasped. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was too much of a coincidence. I mean, how could anyone or anything know what we were doing? We were just playing with a stupid board game, right? But it didn't feel like a game anymore. Then the page refreshed again, and this time there was no text, just an image, a grainy photo of us, sitting in the dark, around the Ouija board. The picture wasn't from my laptop's webcam. Number It was taken from the ceiling. We stared at the screen in stunned silence, and then Rachel did what we should have done from the start. She slammed the laptop shut. "Okay, what the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Max tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was scared too. He kept glancing up at the ceiling, like maybe there was someone, or something, watching us from the shadows. "Guys, it's probably just, like, a prank site," he stammered. But even he didn't believe it. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, too freaked out to move. Finally, Rachel spoke up. "I think we need to stop, like, right now." And that's when the lights in my apartment flickered. Just once, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. We blew out the candles, shoved the Ouija board back in the box, and agreed not to talk about what happened that night. Not to anyone. But it didn't end there. Not even close. I thought that shutting the laptop, blowing out the candles, and packing away the Ouija board would be the end of it. I thought if we just left it alone, the whole thing would go away, like a bad dream you forget about after a few days. But no. Things only got worse from there. Way worse. The next day, I woke up to a weird message on my phone. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Just a random string of numbers with no name attached. The message read, "You shouldn't have looked." My heart stopped. I stared at my phone for a solid minute, trying to convince myself it was some kind of prank. Maybe Max or Rachel thought it'd be funny to mess with me, but Max could barely work his own phone half the time, and Rachel wasn't exactly the type to pull this kind of stunt. I texted both of them anyway. Me. "Yo, did you send me something this morning?" Max. "Nah, dude." "Why?" Rachel. "Same here. What's going on?" I decided not to tell them. I just said, "Never mind." I figured it had to be some weird spam thing, and I was reading too much into it. But that wasn't the last message. Later that night, as I was lying in bed scrolling through Instagram, another text came through. This one hit harder. "Did you find what you were searching for?" My chest tightened, and I swear to God, it felt like the temperature in my room dropped 10 degrees. I sat up, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what was happening. My brain was racing. I thought about the photo we saw on that dark web page, the one of us sitting around the Ouija board, taken from somewhere above us. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a photo. It was me, sitting on my bed, in real time. I swear, I almost dropped my phone. The angle of the photo, it was taken from my closet. My closet door was cracked open just a bit, and through that gap, you could see the corner of my bed and me, lying there with my phone in my hand. I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. My skin prickled like a million tiny needles were pressing into it. I threw my blanket off and jumped out of bed, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Slowly, I walked toward the closet door. My hands were shaking, and I swear I could feel something watching me from the darkness inside. I yanked the door open. Nothing, just my clothes, some boxes and old shoes. No camera, no person. But the air inside the closet felt wrong, like someone had been standing there just seconds before. I closed the door, locked it, and sat back on my bed, trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed again, and I almost didn't want to look, but I had to. It was another message. I see you. I shut my phone off, tossed it across the room, and buried my face in my hands. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't. Stuff like this only happens in movies, but it was real. Too real. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, staring at the closet door, convinced that if I looked away for even a second, something or someone would come out of it. The next day, I told Max and Rachel everything, every message, every photo, every creepy detail. Max looked pale. Rachel's hands were shaking as she listened. Neither of them had gotten any weird messages, but both admitted that they hadn't been able to sleep since that night. Rachel told me she'd been hearing strange tapping sounds on her windows, even though she lived on the 3rd floor. Max tried to laugh it off, but he wasn't convincing anyone. It's probably some hacker, right? Like someone on the dark web just messing with us. Why would a hacker mess with us? Rachel snapped. We're nobodies. We're not worth stalking. I could tell Max didn't have an answer for that. He just kept rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them up, even though it wasn't cold in my apartment. We agreed to stay off the dark web, block any unknown numbers, and forget the whole thing ever happened. Maybe if we ignored it long enough, it would go away. At least, that's what we told ourselves. But it didn't stop. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something new, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the closet this time. It was coming from my window. Now, I live on the 2nd floor, so there's no way someone could just walk up and knock on my window. But the sound was clear. 3 taps, perfectly spaced, like someone gently knocking with their knuckles. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, but I could see the faint outline of my window across the room. And then, tap, tap, tap. The noise sent chills down my spine. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed, "Don't look! Just stay in bed. Whatever it is, don't acknowledge it." But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I slid out of bed, knees weak, and took slow, cautious steps toward the window. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was like the air was waiting for me to do something. I reached the window, and with a shaky breath, pulled back the curtain just an inch. There was nothing. Just the empty street below, bathed in the orange glow of a street lamp. No person, no hand, no anything. I let out a shaky breath, feeling equal parts relieved and terrified. But then, just as I started to close the curtain, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I almost didn't check it, but curiosity and fear got the better of me. I unlocked my phone and opened the message. It was another photo. It showed me, standing by the window, curtain in hand. The angle of the photo, from outside my window. I dropped my phone like it had burned me. My breathing was shallow, and my chest felt tight. There was no way someone could have taken that picture. I had just looked outside. There was nobody there. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely text Max and Rachel, but I managed to send them both a message. Me, it's still happening. Max responded almost instantly. Max, same here. Rachel too. We need to figure this out. That's when Rachel sent something that made my blood run cold. It was a screenshot of her phone, another message from the same unknown number. You shouldn't have looked online. And underneath it, a photo. It was of the three of us, sitting together in my apartment, from earlier that day. The angle of the photo, from inside the closet. We stopped sleeping after that, all three of us. It wasn't like we got together and made a pact to stay awake. We just couldn't bring ourselves to close our eyes. It didn't matter if it was day or night. Every little sound, every buzz from our phones, every creak of the floor made us feel like we were being watched. And not just by someone, by something we couldn't understand. Max stayed over at my place for the next couple of days, and Rachel came by every afternoon after her classes. None of us wanted to be alone. It felt safer if we stuck together, like maybe if we were in the same room, whatever was happening couldn't get to us. But deep down, we knew that wasn't true. We tried to figure out how it all connected. The messages, the photos, the Ouija board, and the website from the dark web. None of it made sense. Max even went back on his laptop to try and retrace the steps we took online, but the link to that page, the answer, was gone. It was like the site had disappeared into thin air, as if it had never existed in the first place. Every time Max opened his laptop, I felt my stomach turn. I told him it was a bad idea, but he insisted on checking, said he wanted to understand what we were dealing with, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was just as lost as the rest of us. Then, 3 days after everything started, a package showed up on my doorstep. There was no return address, no delivery label, just a small, plain black box, sitting on the welcome mat outside my apartment door, like it had been placed there by hand. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Rachel was sitting on the couch behind me, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, and Max was in the kitchen, making coffee. "Guys!" I called out, not taking my eyes off the box. Rachel looked up. "What is it?" Max walked over, wiping his hands on his hoodie. "You order something?" I shook my head. "Number, it's just here." We stood there for a moment, all three of us just staring at the box like it was going to explode. I don't know why, but the sight of it filled me with this overwhelming sense of dread, like opening it would be the biggest mistake of my life. "Maybe it's from whoever sent those messages," Rachel whispered. Max scoffed, but it was forced. "You think the dark web does Amazon Prime now?" But even he wasn't laughing anymore. I nudged the box with the toe of my shoe, half expecting it to move. It didn't. It just sat there, black and silent, radiating bad energy like it was waiting for us to open it. Rachel bit her lip. "What if there's, like, a bomb in there or something?" "Doubt it," Max muttered, though I could tell the thought had crossed his mind too. Eventually, Max, being Max, decided to take charge. "We need to see what's inside," he said, crouching down next to the box. Before I could stop him, he picked it up and shook it gently. Something shifted inside. A soft thud, like a small object hitting the side of the box. I winced. "Careful, man." Max rolled his eyes. "It's not a bomb." He set the box down on the coffee table and looked at me and Rachel. "You guys ready?" "No," Rachel and I said in unison. Max ignored us and slowly peeled off the lid. Inside the box was a phone. Not just any phone. It was my phone. Or at least, it was the exact same make and model as mine, right down to the same case, same color, and the same small crack in the corner of the screen that I got last month when I dropped it. But here's the thing. My phone was sitting on the nightstand in my bedroom. I knew because I had left it there that morning. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the phone in the box. Max picked it up and turned it over in his hands. "Dude, this is your phone. That's impossible," I whispered. Max pressed the power button. The screen lit up instantly, revealing the lock screen, a photo of me, Max, and Rachel at the beach last summer. The exact same lock screen I had on my actual phone. Rachel backed away from the table. This isn't right," she whispered. Max glanced at me. "You sure yours is in the bedroom?" I nodded. My throat felt dry and my hands were shaking. "Go check if you don't believe me." Max stood up and sprinted into my room. He came back a few seconds later, holding my real phone. He held both phones side by side, flipping between them, checking the cases, the cracks, the screen backgrounds. "They're identical," he whispered. I sat down hard on the couch, my mind spinning. This wasn't just some prank. This was something else. Something I couldn't explain. Then the phone in the box buzzed. We all jumped. Max nearly dropped the phone as the screen lit up with a new message notification. It was from the same unknown number. "Open me." Max stared at the message, his hand frozen in midair. I wanted to tell him to put the phone down, to throw it out the window, to get it as far away from us as possible. But instead, I just sat there, frozen in fear. Rachel broke the silence. "Don't open it, Max. Please." But Max was already unlocking the phone. His fingers were trembling, but he swiped the screen and opened the message. There was a single image attached. It showed us, me, Max, and Rachel, sitting right there on the couch, staring at the phone. But the room in the photo, it wasn't the same. The walls were wrong. They were cracked and crumbling, covered in dark stains. The ceiling had deep, jagged scratches running across it, like something with claws had dragged them there. And the three of us in the photo? We didn't look right. Our faces were pale, our eyes sunken and lifeless like we had been dead for days. Max cursed under his breath and dropped the phone onto the coffee table like it had burned him. None of us spoke for a long moment. Then the phone buzzed again. Another message. "I told you not to look online." And then the lights in my apartment cut out. We sat there in the darkness, the only light coming from the glow of the phone screen, still showing that horrible photo of us. And from somewhere in the pitch black room, we heard tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the walls. We sat there, paralyzed in the dark. The only light came from the dim glow of the phone on the coffee table, casting eerie shadows across our faces. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, and coming from inside the walls. Tap, tap, tap. Rachel squeezed my arm so hard it hurt. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I whispered back, barely able to breathe. My mind raced, trying to come up with any logical explanation, but nothing made sense. No pipes could make a sound that precise, that rhythmic. It sounded intentional. Max grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming the beam toward the walls. It didn't help. The light only deepened the shadows in the corners of the room, making it feel like something was waiting just out of sight. And then the tapping changed. It wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was moving. It started at one end of the room, behind the TV. Then it shifted, tap, 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 across the wall behind the couch, then to the corner near the kitchen. It was circling us. "We need to get out of here," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. Max stood up, clutching his flashlight like it was a weapon. "Yeah, we leave now." We scrambled to our feet, shoving the creepy black phone into the box and slamming the lid shut. Max tucked it under his arm, muttering something about throwing it in a dumpster on the way out. Rachel grabbed her bag, and I grabbed my keys. The three of us bolted toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it, the click of a lock sliding into place. Not the front door, the closet door. I stopped cold, my hand hovering just above the doorknob. The air in the room shifted again, heavy and suffocating, like the walls were pressing in on us. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Rachel nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Max swung the flashlight toward the closet. The door, which had been shut just minutes ago, was now cracked open, just a sliver, like something had nudged it from the inside. The tapping started again, louder this time, coming from inside the closet. Tap, tap, tap. None of us moved. We stood frozen in place, watching the door as if it might swing open on its own. My chest felt tight, my skin clammy with cold sweat. Then Max did the dumbest thing imaginable. He took a step toward the closet. "Max, don't!" Rachel hissed, grabbing his arm. "We have to see what's in there," he whispered. "No, we don't!" I snapped, but it was too late. Max pulled away from Rachel and reached out toward the closet door. His hand trembled as he pushed it open just a little wider. The flashlight beam sliced into the darkness inside the closet, and we saw it. For a split second, I thought I was looking at myself. There was a figure standing in the back of the closet, hunched and contorted, its limbs too long and too thin, with pale, clammy skin stretched tight over its bones. But the worst part was its face. It was my face. Only, not quite. Its eyes were too large, too black, and sunken deep into its skull. Its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, revealing rows of small, jagged teeth. The skin around its lips was cracked and peeling, as if it had been smiling for far too long. It tilted its head, mimicking Max's movement, like it was studying us. And then it whispered, in a voice that sounded like mine, but was wrong. "I told you not to look." Max stumbled back with a curse, slamming the closet door shut. The tapping exploded all around us, frantic and chaotic now, coming from every wall, every corner. Tap, 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 tap. "We need to go!" Rachel screamed, yanking the front door open. We didn't wait. We bolted out of the apartment and down the stairs, not stopping until we were outside on the street, gasping for air. The cool night breeze hit my face, but it didn't help. I still felt like something was breathing down my neck. Max threw the black box into a dumpster across the street, and we kept walking, fast, as far away from my building as possible. We ended up at an all-night diner a few blocks away. None of us had said a word since we left the apartment. We sat in the corner booth, staring at the table, too shaken to speak. Finally, Max broke the silence. "What the hell was that thing?" I shook my head, still trying to wrap my mind around what I'd seen. It looked like me, but it wasn't me. Rachel shivered. "It wasn't just a ghost, was it? This is something else." We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the diner's fluorescent lights buzzing above us. For a moment, I thought maybe we were safe. Maybe it was over. Then Rachel's phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her bag, and I watched the colour drain from her face. "What is it?" Max asked, leaning over the table. Rachel turned her phone around so we could see the screen. It was another message from the same unknown number. "You can't run." Attached was a photo. It showed the three of us, sitting in that very booth, at that very diner. Only, something was wrong with the photo. The walls in the picture weren't the clean, white walls of the diner. They were cracked and stained, the same as the walls in the photo we'd seen earlier. The ones with those horrible scratches across the ceiling. And in the corner of the photo, just barely visible in the shadows, was the thing from the closet. It was standing behind us, watching, waiting. We left the diner without saying a word. What else could we say? We were running on adrenaline and fear, hearts pounding in sync with every step. The city felt empty, even though we knew it wasn't. Streetlights flickered, and the shadows between buildings looked darker than usual, like something was waiting just out of sight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing from the closet trailing behind us. My skin crawled with the feeling that we were being followed, but no matter how many times I looked, the street stayed empty. Max, Rachel and I walked in silence, all of us too scared to suggest where to go next. None of our apartments felt safe. Not after what we'd seen. Every corner felt like a trap. Every streetlight buzzed like a warning. And that black box, how the hell had it shown up on my doorstep? How had someone or something gotten that photo of us at the diner? Where do we go? Rachel finally whispered, her voice cracking. She was hugging herself, her eyes darting to every shadow. Max looked pale, his hands stuffed deep into his hoodie pockets. We could crash at my uncle's cabin. It's out in the woods, no cell service, no internet. Maybe it can't follow us there. It was the only idea we had, so we started walking toward the bus station. We figured if we could get out of the city, maybe we could buy some time, figure out what the hell was happening to us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. When we got to the bus station, the clock on the wall read 1:34 a.m. The place was nearly deserted, just a bored-looking attendant behind the counter and a few people scattered across the benches, dozing or scrolling through their phones. Max walked up to the counter to buy tickets, and Rachel and I sat down on one of the benches, both of us too tired and too scared to talk. That's when my phone buzzed. My real phone, the one I kept in my pocket the whole time. My heart stopped. Slowly, I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was another message from that same unknown number. You can't hide. Attached was a photo, one that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of us, sitting at the bus station, right now. The photo was taken from somewhere above us, as if someone was looking down from the ceiling. But when I looked up, there was nothing there, just the flickering fluorescent lights. Rachel must have noticed the look on my face. What? What is it? I showed her the message. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. How is this even possible? Before I could respond, Max came jogging back over, tickets in hand. Okay, bus leaves in 15 minutes. He stopped when he saw our faces. What now? I held out my phone, and he cursed under his breath. This isn't real, man. It can't be real. But it was. Every instinct in my body told me that whatever was doing this, whatever had found us, was very, very real. We sat in silence, waiting for the bus, each of us stealing glances at the doors, the shadows, the other people at the station. Every movement felt like a threat. Every noise made my skin crawl. I kept waiting for the thing from the closet to show up, grinning with that awful smile. And then the lights flickered. Just once. I tensed, gripping my phone so tight my knuckles turned white. Rachel grabbed my arm, and Max looked around, muttering, "Not now, please, not now." When the lights flickered again, we heard it. The tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the bus station, soft but deliberate, like it was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. Then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video. I didn't want to open it. Every part of me screamed, "Don't look." But my thumb moved on its own, and the video opened. It was grainy and shaky, like it had been filmed on an old phone. The camera was moving through a dark hallway, my apartment hallway. The same crooked picture frames on the walls, the same stained carpet. The person filming reached my front door. For a moment, the camera lingered there, like it was waiting, and then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. The camera moved inside. It panned over the living room, the Ouija board still on the coffee table, the candles burned down to wax puddles. Then the camera turned toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could feel Rachel shaking next to me. Max's jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. The camera moved down the hallway and stopped outside my bedroom door. It opened, and there, standing in the doorway, was the thing. It was hunched, pale, and wrong, with limbs too long and a smile too wide. Its dark eyes gleamed in the dim light, like it was amused by the whole thing. like it had been waiting for us to watch. Then the camera turned around, and I saw us. Me, Max, and Rachel. We were sitting on the couch in my apartment, staring at the closet door. We looked lifeless, pale. Our eyes were hollow, our expressions blank, as if our bodies were just empty shells, waiting for something to fill them. The video ended, and the screen went black. For a moment, none of us moved. We just sat there, frozen in horror, as the reality of what we'd just seen sank in. Then the lights in the bus station went out completely, plunging us into darkness, and from the shadows, we heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was close now, too close. I grabbed Rachel's hand, and Max grabbed mine, and we stood up, ready to run. But before we could take a step, the tapping stopped, and a voice whispered from the darkness, "It's already over." The lights flickered back on. The station was empty. The people who'd been waiting on the benches, gone. The attendant behind the counter, gone. The doors to the outside, locked. We were alone. And then my phone buzzed one last time. It was another message. "We told you not to look." And attached was a photo. It showed the three of us, standing in the bus station, just like we were now, but behind us, reflected in the glass of the station doors, was the thing from the closet. And this time, it was smiling. We asked the Ouija board who was haunting our apartment. It spelled out my name. All right, so I'll start this off by saying that I'm not really into paranormal stuff. Like, I watch the occasional horror movie and enjoy a good ghost story here and there. But I'm definitely the kind of guy who rolls his eyes when someone tells me they saw a shadow figure in their kitchen or their grandma's house is totally haunted. You know the type. Skeptic, grounded in reality. Well, I was that guy. Until last week. I live with my two roommates, Andy and Jess, in a pretty standard 2-bedroom apartment just outside the city. Nothing too fancy, but it's got charm, creaky wood floors, weird old windows that never quite close right, and neighbours who we never hear from. And listen, we've all joked from time to time that the place is a little off. Lights flicker sometimes. The bathroom faucet has a habit of turning itself on in the middle of the night. Jess once swore up and down that she heard whispering through the vent in her room, but Andy and I just told her she was hearing neighbours through the thin walls. You get the idea. Creepy, but nothing worth freaking out about. At least, that's what we thought. A couple of nights ago, Jess came back from hanging out with some friends and pulled out this old beat-up Ouija board she said they found at a thrift store. It looked ancient. The wood was cracked and splintered around the edges, the letters faded and smudged. The thing reeked of bad ideas. But Jess, being Jess, was all hyped about using it. "Come on," she said, waving the board in my face. "Let's ask it some questions. What's the worst that could happen?" Andy rolled his eyes and gave me this look like, "Are we really doing this?" I shrugged. "Sure, why not?" In hindsight, I should have gone with my gut and tossed that thing straight into the trash. We waited until later that night to try it out, after a few beers, of course, because making poor decisions while slightly buzzed is kind of our specialty. Jess dimmed the lights, Andy pulled up some spooky music on his phone, and we all sat cross-legged on the floor with the Ouija board between us. "Okay, so how does this even work?" Andy asked, nudging the board with his foot. "Do we just ask it questions or something?" Jess looked way too excited. "Yep, we just put our fingers on the planchette and let it move. It'll spell out answers, but..." She held up a finger dramatically. "You have to take it seriously, no messing around, or it won't work." I wasn't exactly taking it seriously, but I played along anyway. We all placed our fingers on the little plastic planchette, and Jess started with the basics. "Is anyone here with us?" At first, nothing happened. We sat there in silence for what felt like a full minute, fingers resting lightly on the planchette, waiting for some supernatural force to prove its existence. I could feel Andy suppressing a laugh. Jess tried again. Is there a spirit in this apartment? The planchette didn't move. I think your ghost is broken, Andy snorted. Shut up. Jess shot him a look, then leaned in closer to the board. If anyone's there, please give us a sign. And then it happened. The planchette twitched. Just the tiniest little jerk to the right, so subtle that I almost thought it was my imagination. Andy sat up straighter, his expression going from amused to something else. Did you guys just feel that? He whispered. Yeah, Jess breathed. Ask it something else. I decided to jump in. What's your name? I asked, half expecting the thing to stay still again, but it didn't. The planchette slowly, painfully, dragged itself across the board, sliding from one letter to the next in smooth, deliberate movements. D. A. N. I stared at the letters, trying to process what I was seeing. Dan, Jess read out loud, her voice low. Okay, that's creepy. Yeah, Andy agreed, glancing at me. Isn't that... Yeah, I cut him off. That's my name. I laughed nervously, trying to play it off, but my heart was racing. Weird coincidence, I told myself. No big deal. The planchette could have just randomly landed on those letters, right? It didn't mean anything. It was just a game, right? But Jess wasn't done. Why are you here, Dan? She asked, eyes locked on the board. This time the planchette moved faster, like whatever was on the other side was eager to respond. Why? Oh, you. For a second, I thought maybe Jess or Andy was messing with me, like one of them was secretly pushing the planchette to screw with me. But their faces told a different story. Jess looked pale, her hand trembling slightly, and Andy had this wide-eyed, what the hell is happening expression plastered across his face. I swallowed hard. Okay, haha. Very funny, I said, trying to inject some humor into my voice, but it came out shaky. Which one of you is doing that? Neither of them answered. Seriously, you guys, I pressed. You're messing with me, right? Jess shook her head slowly. I swear, I didn't touch it. Andy leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. This is really freaking weird, dude. We sat there for a moment in tense silence, just staring at the board like it was about to come to life and bite us. I could feel my palms sweating, my mind racing to find a logical explanation for what just happened. All right, I said finally, trying to sound more confident than I felt. That was weird, but it's just a game. Let's not freak out. Jess wasn't buying it. Ask it something else, she whispered, eyes wide. Ask it who's haunting the apartment. I don't think that's a good idea, I muttered. Just do it, she insisted, voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, my heart thudding in my chest, then slowly leaned back over the board. Who's haunting this place? I asked. The planchette began to move almost immediately, gliding across the board with a strange kind of urgency, as if the spirit, or whatever the hell it was, couldn't wait to answer. D. A. N. It spelled out my name. Again. Jess let out a small, involuntary gasp. Andy scooted back from the board, muttering, Nope, I'm out. But I just sat there, frozen, staring at the letters like they were going to rearrange themselves into something less terrifying if I looked long enough. What the hell? I whispered. And then the planchette did something I'll never forget. It started moving again, this time without anyone touching it. Slowly it dragged itself across the board, spelling out one final message before coming to a stop. I. A. M. Y. O. U. That's when the lights flickered, and the room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as this overwhelming sense of dread settled over me, like a dark cloud had just filled the room. And the worst part, as the lights flickered, I caught a glimpse of something, just for a split second, reflected in the window behind Jess. It was my face, but the expression staring back at me wasn't mine. After that, everything felt wrong. The room was so still, it was like the air had been sucked out, heavy and stale. We sat there, not saying a word, trying to process what just happened. I could hear my pulse thumping in my ears, and it felt like the walls were slowly closing in. Nobody knew what to say. Jess broke the silence first, her voice barely audible. We need to stop. We need to put it away." Andy nodded quickly. "Yeah, no arguments here." He grabbed the planchette like it was some kind of ticking bomb and slammed it down onto the board. "Game over." I didn't argue. I just wanted the thing gone. But the weird part, even after we shoved the board back into the old cardboard box it came in and tossed it into the corner of the room, the feeling didn't go away. That creeping sense of being watched, like something had wormed its way into the apartment and was now waiting quietly, hiding just out of sight. The three of us tried to shake it off. Andy put on some dumb comedy movie to lighten the mood, and Jess opened another beer. But none of it worked. I could tell we were all still rattled. Jess kept glancing toward the corner where the board was sitting, like she was expecting it to start moving on its own, and Andy wouldn't stop tapping his knee, which he only does when he's really nervous. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about the message. "I am you." What the hell did that mean? By the time I finally dragged myself to bed, it was nearly 2 a.m. I tried telling myself it was just a stupid game, that Ouija boards don't actually work, and we'd all just psyched ourselves out. But even as I lay there in the dark, my mind wouldn't quit. Every little creak from the apartment sounded too loud. Every gust of wind rattling the windows felt too deliberate, like something was trying to get in. I kept telling myself to relax, but my brain wasn't having it. And then the whispering started. At first, I thought it was just in my head. One of those things where you think you hear something, but it's not really there. But it wasn't like that. This was different. It was coming from the walls. It was faint at first, like a radio left on low volume in another room. I pressed my ear against the wall next to my bed, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't make out words, just this soft, rhythmic murmuring. A voice, but not quite human. It was low and scratchy, like someone trying to speak through a bad connection. And the worst part? It wasn't coming from Jess's or Andy's room. It was coming from inside the wall. I shot upright in bed, my heart slamming against my ribcage. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand, turning on the flashlight and sweeping it around the room. Nothing, just my dresser, my half-unpacked laundry, and a few posters on the walls. Everything was exactly where it should be. Except, it didn't feel right. I listened again. The whispering had stopped, but the silence it left behind was somehow worse. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding just outside the edge of the light, waiting for me to fall asleep. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was late, I was tired, and the whole Ouija thing had gotten under my skin. I just needed to sleep, and everything would feel normal in the morning. But deep down, I knew nothing would ever feel normal again. The next morning, I told Jess and Andy about the whispering. I thought they'd laugh it off, but they didn't. Jess just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes, like I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. "You heard it too," she whispered. That stopped me cold. "What do you mean too?" Jess glanced toward the vent in the living room, biting her lip. "I've been hearing stuff, for weeks," she admitted. "I thought it was just the neighbors, but it's not. It's coming from inside the walls. Sometimes it sounds like, I don't know, like a voice trying to say my name." I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. This wasn't just some one-time thing. It had been happening for a while, long before we ever touched that damn board. Andy didn't say anything for a long time, just stared down at his cereal like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Then, without looking up, he muttered, I heard it too, last night. Jess and I exchanged nervous glances. What did you hear? I asked. Andy hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know, man. It was like whispering, but it didn't sound like English. I couldn't understand it. But what? Jess pressed, her voice shaky. Andy looked up at us, his face pale. It sounded pissed. That's when things really started to spiral. Little things at first, lights flickering more often, doors creaking open on their own. Jess swore her bedroom door opened by itself one night while she was lying in bed, even though she'd locked it. Andy kept hearing tapping sounds coming from the ceiling like someone or something was crawling around up there. And me? I started having dreams. At first, they were just flashes, dark hallways, broken mirrors, and glimpses of myself. But it wasn't really me. It was like watching a version of myself from a distance, distorted and twisted, with this empty, hollow look in my eyes. One dream in particular stuck with me. I was standing in the bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror. Everything looked normal at first. Then, slowly, my reflection smiled. But I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, as the version of me in the mirror grinned wider and wider until it looked more like a snarl. And then it whispered, in a voice that was barely my own, I am you. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with the overwhelming sensation that someone had been standing right next to my bed, watching me sleep. After that, I refused to sleep with the lights off. The breaking point came 2 nights later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering again. Only this time, it was louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside my room. I sat up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The air was thick, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And then I saw it, out of the corner of my eye, just barely visible in the dim light of my phone screen. A figure. It was standing at the foot of my bed, its shape blurry and indistinct, but its face was mine, and it was smiling. I didn't move. I couldn't. The thing at the foot of my bed, it wasn't just standing there. It was leaning in, like it was waiting for me to notice it. The smile on its face was wrong, too wide, like the muscles in my face weren't built to stretch that far. And its eyes. God, its eyes were dull and lifeless, like they were just holes drilled into my skull. For a second, I thought I was still dreaming. I kept blinking, hoping it would disappear, but it didn't. It was real, or at least it felt real. And somehow, in the dim glow of my phone screen, I knew that thing was me. I don't remember moving. 1 second I was sitting there, frozen in fear, and the next I was sprinting down the hallway to the living room, nearly tripping over myself in the dark. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I just knew I had to get away from it. Andy and Jess were both asleep, but I didn't care. I shook them awake hard, nearly yanking Jess off the couch. We need to go. Now! My voice didn't even sound like my own. Jess sat up, groggy and annoyed. What the hell, Dan? It's the middle of the night. It's here, I whispered, feeling like the words were barely escaping my throat. There's something in my room. That woke Andy up. What do you mean, something? Like an intruder? No. I shook my head violently. It's me. Or it looks like me. I don't know how to explain it. Just trust me. We have to leave. I was already halfway to the door when I realized something. My hand was shaking as I reached for the lock. I tried turning it, but it was already unlocked. Andy was behind me now, rubbing the back of his neck, looking as spooked as I'd ever seen him. I locked that before we went to bed, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The blood drained from my face. I could feel the walls closing in again, that same suffocating heaviness pressing down on me. It doesn't matter, I whispered. It's already inside. We didn't stay the night. I grabbed my car keys, and the three of us piled into my beat-up Honda, not even bothering to pack a bag. I didn't know where we were going, anywhere but here. Jess sat in the passenger seat, arms wrapped tightly around herself, while Andy kept looking over his shoulder like he expected to see that thing in the back seat. None of us spoke for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal as we drove aimlessly through the city streets. It was surreal, like being trapped in a dream where everything looks familiar but feels wrong. Finally, Jess broke the silence. "Do you think it's following us?" I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about it. All I knew was that every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I expected to see my own reflection staring back at me. Not the real me, but the other one. The one with the empty eyes and that awful too wide smile. We ended up crashing at Jess's friend's place, a girl named Katie who was way too cool about 3 freaked out idiots showing up at her door in the middle of the night. "Whatever," she said, waving us in. "Just don't murder me in my sleep, okay?" Her apartment was small and cluttered but weirdly comforting. It was one of those places with fairy lights strung across the ceiling and too many throw pillows on the couch. It felt safe. For the first time all night, I started to relax. That was a mistake. We stayed up late, huddled in Katie's living room, trying to make sense of what happened. Jess kept saying we shouldn't have used the Ouija board, like it was some kind of cursed object. Andy thought maybe we were just imagining things, but I could tell he didn't really believe that. Not after the way the lock on the front door was wide open when it shouldn't have been. As for me, I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that the thing I saw in my room, it wasn't human, and it wanted me. Around 4 a.m., Katie went to bed, and the three of us curled up on the couch, too exhausted to stay awake but too afraid to fall asleep. Eventually, though, sleep won, and that's when things got worse. I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was soft at first, barely a whimper, but it quickly grew louder, like whoever it was couldn't hold it in any longer. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room. Andy was still asleep, snoring softly. Jess was curled up under a blanket, her face half buried in a pillow. The crying wasn't coming from either of them. I followed the sound into the tiny hallway leading to Katie's room, every step making my skin crawl. The crying got louder the closer I got, and something about it was wrong. It didn't sound like Katie, or anyone, really. It was high-pitched, almost like a child's voice, but warped and unnatural, as if someone was pretending to cry. I reached Katie's door and slowly pushed it open. The room was dark, but I could just make out the shape of Katie's bed. She was sitting up, facing away from me, her shoulders shaking with each sob. "Katie?" I whispered, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and the second my hand made contact, she went completely still. No more sobbing, no more shaking, just stillness. And then, slowly, she turned around. It wasn't Katie. It was me. The version of me with the dead eyes and that horrible, twisted smile. It grinned up at me in the dark, its teeth glinting in the dim light from the hallway. And then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, it said, "You can't run from yourself." I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, Andy and Jess were dragging me back into the living room, their faces pale with fear. "What the hell, Dan?" Andy shouted, shaking me by the shoulders. "What's going on?" I couldn't speak. I just kept shaking my head, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen wasn't real. But it was. I knew it was. Jess looked terrified. "We need to leave," she whispered. "We need to get out of here, right now." "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "It doesn't matter where we go." They both stared at me, confused. "It's not just in the apartment," I said, feeling the weight of the truth settle over me like a lead blanket. "It's in me." After that, Things started to unravel fast. We couldn't stay at Katie's place. I could see it in her eyes. She didn't want to say it outright, but she was scared of me. And honestly, I didn't blame her. If I had seen what she saw, me standing in her room, but with that thing's face, I would have wanted me gone too. So we left. No plan, no destination, just piling back into the car and driving aimlessly through the empty streets. None of us spoke. It was one of those heavy, suffocating silences where everyone's too afraid to say what they're thinking out loud. Whatever had followed us, whatever had attached itself to me, wasn't going to let go. I could feel it inside me now. Not like I was possessed exactly, but more like it was watching. From somewhere just behind my eyes. Like if I stopped concentrating for even a second, it would slip into the driver's seat and I'd be a passenger in my own body. We ended up at a crappy 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, hoping the bright fluorescent lights would make us feel safer. They didn't. The coffee tasted like burnt dirt, but at least it was hot. We sat there for a long time, trying to come up with some kind of plan. Maybe we need to talk to someone, Jess suggested, stirring her coffee anxiously. Like, I don't know, a priest or a psychic. Andy shook his head. I don't think any of that stuff works, Jess. This isn't some movie where holy water fixes everything. It's something else. They both looked at me, like I had the answers, but I didn't. I was just as lost as they were. All I knew was that whatever was happening wasn't something we could outrun or hide from. We have to do something, Jess whispered, her voice cracking. If we just sit around waiting, it'll win. I didn't ask what she meant by win. I already knew. That's when Jess had the idea. What if we trick it? Andy raised an eyebrow. Trick it? How? We use a mirror, she said, sounding unsure even as she said it. I read about this thing once, something about mirrors being doorways, reflections being a way to trap spirits. If it's connected to Dan through his reflection, maybe we can push it out. Andy gave her a skeptical look, but honestly, it was the only idea we had, and we were desperate. So we left the diner and drove back to the apartment. I know, terrible idea, right? Going back to the very place where everything started. But there was nowhere else to go, and we needed a mirror. A big one. The drive back felt surreal, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I kept glancing at myself in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that twisted version of me staring back. But every time I checked, it was just me. At least, for now. When we got to the apartment, the place was darker than I remembered. The lights flickered as soon as we stepped inside, casting strange shadows along the walls. It felt like the building itself was alive, waiting for us. Jess grabbed the full-length mirror from her room, dragging it into the living room while Andy blocked the front door with the couch, like that would stop whatever was coming for us. Okay, Jess said, slightly out of breath. Dan, you need to sit in front of the mirror. Just look at yourself. Keep eye contact. No matter what happens, don't look away. I swallowed hard. What if... Don't look away. Her voice was shaky, but there was no room for argument, so I did what she said. I sat cross-legged on the floor, facing the mirror, and stared at my reflection. At first, nothing happened. It was just me, tired, pale, eyes slightly bloodshot from lack of sleep. But then, something shifted. The reflection tilted its head. I didn't move, but the other me in the mirror did. Guys, I whispered, my voice barely audible. It's happening. The reflection kept moving. Slow, deliberate movements, like it was testing the limits of the mirror. Its smile stretched across its face again, impossibly wide, the corners of its mouth pulling upward in a way no human face should. I could feel Jess and Andy standing behind me, frozen in place. Don't look away, Jess whispered, her voice shaking. "It's trying to trick you." The reflection leaned closer, pressing its face against the glass. Its eyes locked onto mine, those dark, lifeless pits that seemed to pull at something inside me, like they were trying to reach through the mirror and drag me in. And then it spoke. "I told you," it whispered, its voice a horrible, distorted version of my own. "You can't run. You can't hide. I am you." I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms, trying to keep my breathing steady. The reflection pressed harder against the glass, like it was ready to step out and take my place. "Do it now!" Jess hissed from behind me. Without breaking eye contact, I reached for the piece of chalk Jess had given me earlier. She said it was part of the trick. Something about drawing a circle to trap whatever was inside. I didn't understand how it worked, but I didn't care. With trembling hands, I reached out and began to draw on the surface of the mirror. The reflection's grin faltered, just for a second. It could tell what I was doing. "You think this will save you?" it hissed, its voice low and venomous. "You think you can trap me?" I kept drawing, faster now, the chalk scraping against the glass. The reflection pressed harder against the mirror, its face starting to distort, like it was pushing through a thin layer of water. And then, just as I finished the circle, the reflection stopped. For a split second, everything went still, and then it screamed. The sound was unlike anything I've ever heard. This awful, high-pitched wail that rattled the windows and made my skin crawl. The reflection's face twisted in rage, its features warping and shifting as it slammed itself against the glass, over and over again, trying to break free, but the circle held. Jess grabbed my arm and yanked me away from the mirror. "We need to cover it. Now!" she shouted. Andy threw a blanket over the mirror, muffling the sound of the thing's screams. The moment the glass was covered, the temperature in the room dropped, and the lights flickered wildly before finally stabilizing. We stood there, panting, staring at the covered mirror like it was a ticking bomb. Is it over?" Andy whispered. I didn't know, but I could feel something had shifted, like a weight had lifted from my chest. Whatever was inside the mirror, it was trapped, at least for now. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. We didn't sleep that night, none of us. We sat huddled in the living room, stealing glances at the blanket-covered mirror like it was going to explode. Every creak of the apartment made me flinch. Every flicker of the lights sent my heart racing. I kept expecting that thing, the other me, to tear through the fabric and crawl out, grinning that awful grin. But it didn't. Not yet, anyway. Jess insisted that the circle on the mirror would hold, but even she looked uncertain. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and Andy kept pacing the room like a caged animal, muttering to himself about how we needed to do more. But none of us knew what that meant. We were way out of our depth. At some point, the sun started to rise, and the pale morning light bled through the windows, making everything feel more surreal. I think I expected things to feel different, like the nightmare would dissolve with the night, and we'd wake up, laughing about how ridiculous we'd been. But it didn't. The tension in the air stayed. The apartment still felt heavy, like we were sharing it with something that didn't belong, something that wasn't done with us yet. Around 7 a.m., Jess suggested we get rid of the mirror. "We can't just leave it here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. "What if it breaks? What if the circle fades?" "Right," Andy muttered, rubbing his face like he hadn't slept in years. "So what do we do? Just throw it in a dumpster and hope it doesn't follow us home?" "We need to get rid of it somewhere. Safe," Jess said, though she didn't sound convinced, even as the words left her mouth. It was a dumb plan, but it was the only plan we had. We grabbed the mirror, still wrapped in the blanket, and carried it out to the car, the three of us moving like we were handling a live bomb. The thing felt heavier than it should, like whatever was inside it was weighing it down. I swear I could feel it shifting under my hands, restless. The second we got it into the trunk, I slammed it shut and locked the car, even though I knew deep down that locks didn't matter. Andy slid into the passenger seat, while Jess sat in the back, arms wrapped tightly around herself. I could see her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked pale, like she hadn't stopped shaking since last night. "Where are we even taking this thing?" Andy asked, glancing nervously at the trunk. I didn't have an answer. I just started driving, hoping that somehow the road would take us somewhere that made sense. The weird thing about driving in the early morning is how everything feels off. The streets were almost completely empty, and the sunlight cast these long, unnatural shadows across the pavement. It was like the world hadn't fully woken up yet, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what we were going to do next. We ended up driving out to the edge of town, to this old, overgrown hiking trail that Jess remembered from a camping trip years ago. The plan, if you could even call it that, was to hike out as far as we could and leave the mirror in the woods, somewhere deep enough that no one would ever find it. We parked the car at the trailhead and hauled the mirror out of the trunk, still wrapped in the blanket. It felt heavier than before, like whatever was inside it was trying to drag us down. Every step felt harder than the last, the weight of the thing pulling at our arms and at something deeper, like it was pulling at me. By the time we got far enough into the woods, the sun was high in the sky, but the light didn't feel warm. The shadows under the trees were long and sharp, and the whole forest felt off. Silent, except for the occasional creak of branches overhead. "This is far enough," Andy muttered, his voice strained from the effort of carrying the mirror. "Let's leave it here and get the hell out." We set the mirror down at the base of a tree, both of us panting from the effort. Jess knelt beside it, hands trembling as she peeled the blanket away. For a moment we just stood there, staring down at the mirror in the dirt. It looked wrong. The reflection inside wasn't quite right. It wasn't just me anymore. It was the three of us, but our faces were twisted, stretched into those same wide, unnatural grins. "That's not us," Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," I muttered, taking a step back. "It's not." And then, before we could react, the mirror cracked. Not shattered, just a single, jagged crack down the middle. But that was enough. The moment the glass split, the air around us shifted, like a pressure valve had been released. The weight I'd been feeling since last night lifted, just slightly. But the thing inside the mirror wasn't gone. The cracked reflection smiled wider, impossibly wide, and leaned forward, pressing against the glass. I could feel it trying to push through, trying to break free. "Run!" Jess screamed, her voice shrill with panic. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush like animals being chased. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Something was behind us. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, the whispering right on the edge of my hearing. It wasn't just following us. It was inside us. We made it back to the car, slamming the doors shut just as the first raindrops began to fall. I fumbled with the keys, heart pounding, and the engine roared to life. "Go! Go!" Jess shouted from the back seat. I peeled out of the parking lot, tires skidding on the wet pavement. For a few moments, all I could hear was the sound of the rain pounding against the windshield and our ragged breathing. And then, silence. It was over, or at least that's what I told myself. We never talked about what happened after that. Jess and Andy moved out a few weeks later, and I can't blame them. I haven't seen either of them since. As for me, I tried to move on. I really did. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm brushing my teeth or washing my face, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, just for a second, barely long enough to register. It's always me, but not quite. The reflection moves a little too slow, or smiles when I don't, and sometimes, only sometimes, it whispers, "I am you," and no matter how far I run, I know the truth. It never really left. It's still here, and it always will be. We used the Ouija board to ask what was in the basement. It told us not to go down there. All right, so this happened like a couple months ago, and honestly, I still can't wrap my head around it. I wasn't even going to share this at first, but every time I think about it, my brain keeps spiraling back to one question. What the hell was in that basement? And yeah, I know, messing around with a Ouija board is textbook, don't do this unless you want your life ruined territory. But hear me out. It wasn't even my idea. It all started on a boring Friday night. You know the kind. Too broke to go out. Too restless to just sit at home and binge Netflix. My best friend Mason came over with a six-pack and one of those cardboard Hasbro Ouija boards. The kind you buy from Target like it's a party game. Let's see if this thing works, Mason said, throwing it down on my coffee table with this stupid grin on his face. Now look, I'm not some paranoid freak. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that stuff. But I'm also not trying to get involved with something I don't understand. I gave him the whole, "Nah, dude, that's bad juju" speech, but Mason was already setting it up, laying the board flat and popping out the little plastic planchette like he was about to play a round of Scrabble. Our friend Emily showed up not long after, so now it was the three of us. Emily is usually the voice of reason, but she just laughed it off when Mason told her what we were doing. "It's a stupid board game," she said, cracking open a beer. "What's the worst that could happen?" You know, in hindsight, that was a terrible question. So we dimmed the lights, lit a couple candles. Yes, I know how dumb that sounds. And sat around the table with our fingers on the planchette. And for the first few minutes, nothing happened. Just us giggling nervously while Mason tried to act like a fake medium. "Spirits, tell us your secrets," he whispered dramatically. Emily smacked him on the arm. "Be serious, idiot." And then, just like that, the damn thing moved. At first, I thought it was Mason being a jerk, dragging it across the board to mess with us. But when I looked up, his expression was as freaked out as mine. "You're doing that," I said, narrowing my eyes. "Dude, I swear I'm not," Mason whispered, and I could see the goosebumps on his arms. Emily was suddenly all in too, her face dead serious now. "Okay, if no one's moving it, let's ask it something." We all exchanged glances, that weird mix of excitement and fear bubbling under the surface. I could feel my heart thumping harder in my chest. Emily cleared her throat. "Is anyone here with us?" she asked slowly. The planchette slid over to yes. We all stared at each other, our fingers still lightly touching the plastic piece, trying to convince ourselves it was just some weird coincidence. But I could tell from the way Emily was biting her lip that she wasn't as cool as she was pretending to be. Mason leaned in closer. "Okay, spirit, what's your name?" The planchette started moving again, slow and deliberate this time. It spelled out ALEC. "Who the hell is Alec?" Mason muttered under his breath. "Maybe it's a random name," I said, trying to sound rational, even though my stomach was tying itself into knots. Emily wasn't buying it. "Alec, what do you want?" she asked carefully. The planchette twitched, then dragged itself across the board until it landed on a single word. STAY. There was a long, awkward silence after that. We all just sat there, staring at the word like it might start glowing or something. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "All right, this is getting creepy," I said, pulling my hand away from the planchette. "Maybe we should stop." But Mason shook his head. "One more question." I wish I'd stopped him. I really do. He glanced at both of us with this mischievous grin, the one that usually meant he was about to do something reckless. "Let's ask it about the basement," he said. "That's the thing. I have this basement in my house that I almost never use. It's creepy as hell. Bare cement walls, no windows, a single light bulb that flickers sometimes. I keep a few storage bins down there, but that's it. Even though I've lived in this house for over 2 years, I've probably gone down there maybe 3 or 4 times. It just has this weird energy, you know? Like it's not really part of the house. Mason knew I hated that basement, which is probably why he brought it up. He thought it would be funny, so he asked, "Alec, what's in the basement?" I swear to you, the planchette didn't even hesitate. It slid to NO in one quick motion, almost like it was trying to shut us up. Emily pulled her hand away like she'd touched a hot stove. "It doesn't want us to ask," she whispered. But Mason, of course, took that as a challenge. "Why not? What's down there, Alec?" He pushed, and we both glared at him. This time, the planchette moved slower, almost reluctantly. It spelled out DONTGODOWN. We all froze. I felt this cold pit forming in my stomach, like I'd just walked into a room and found something I shouldn't have seen. Even Mason went pale. He gave a nervous laugh, but it was clear he wasn't feeling so cocky anymore. "What do you mean, don't go down?" Emily whispered. The planchette slid to GO, then BACK, and that's when the air shifted. I don't know how else to describe it, but it felt like someone had opened a door in the room. Like suddenly, we weren't alone anymore, and something was standing just out of sight, watching us. "Nope," I said, yanking my hands away from the board. "We're done. I'm not playing this game anymore." Emily nodded and practically threw the planchette off the table. Mason just sat there, his eyes locked on the Ouija board like it was going to start moving on its own. "Dude," he whispered, "what if there's something in the basement for real?" "That's exactly why we're not going down there," I snapped, feeling this wave of anxiety hit me all at once. Mason tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was freaked out too. We all were. Emily got up and turned on all the lights in the room, like that would make everything better. For a second, it almost did. But that uneasy feeling didn't go away. In fact, it felt worse, like the walls were pressing in just a little tighter, like the house itself was trying to warn us. And here's the thing, none of us touched that board again. We put it back in the box, buried it under some old blankets, and tried to pretend it never happened. But deep down, I knew we'd done something we couldn't take back. We'd poked at something that didn't want to be disturbed, and now it was just waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. And the worst part, I kept thinking about the basement. I had this gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, this irrational but overwhelming fear that something was down there, just sitting in the dark, waiting for us to come looking for it. And the worst part, it didn't feel like the board had been trying to protect us. It felt like it was giving us a warning. I didn't touch the Ouija board again after that night, but things in the house started feeling off. At first, it was just little stuff. You know, the kind of things you can brush off if you try hard enough. Lights flickering when they hadn't before, doors being open that I swear I closed. The usual weird house noises felt sharper, somehow more deliberate. The next morning, I found Mason and Emily sitting at my kitchen table, both looking like they'd barely slept. Mason was scrolling through his phone, dark circles under his eyes, and Emily was nursing a cup of coffee, like it was the only thing keeping her from falling over. "So," Emily said, glancing at me over her cup, "that was weird last night, huh?" "Yeah, no kidding," I mumbled, rubbing my face. I'd barely slept myself. Every noise from the basement had kept me wide awake, heart hammering. Mason gave a half-hearted laugh. I still think it was just us freaking ourselves out, like we hyped each other up too much. But even as he said it, I could tell he didn't believe his own words. None of us did. I spent the day trying to shake off that heavy, uncomfortable feeling, but it stuck with me. That creeping sense that something was just waiting, lurking. By the time night rolled around again, the whole house felt heavier, like the walls were saturated with something wrong. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, the way you do when your brain senses something isn't quite right. The room was dead silent, not even the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional groan of the pipes. It was too quiet, like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, Tap. It was faint, like it was coming from far away, but it was steady. I sat up in bed, heart pounding in my chest, trying to figure out where it was coming from. For a second, I thought maybe it was just the wind hitting the windows. But no, the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the basement. I sat there frozen for what felt like forever, listening to that slow, deliberate tapping. I told myself over and over that it wasn't a big deal, that maybe something had just fallen and was swinging back and forth against the wall. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The tapping wasn't random. It was rhythmic. It was intentional. And then, just as I mustered up the courage to move, the sound stopped. Not like it faded out or anything. It just stopped, mid-tap, like whatever had been making the noise knew I was listening. I sat there for a few more minutes, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for it to start again. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Eventually, I convinced myself to get out of bed and check the door to the basement. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept next to my bed, not because I thought it would help, but because it made me feel just a tiny bit less helpless. When I got to the basement door, I saw something that made my skin crawl. The door was cracked open. I swear to you, I never leave that door open. I always make sure it's shut because, like I said, I hate that basement. But there it was, open, just a sliver, like someone had nudged it open from the other side. For a moment, I stood there, staring at that thin line of darkness spilling out from the crack. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to shut the door, lock it, and run back to bed. But there was another part of me, some stupid, reckless part, that needed to know. I leaned forward just a little and listened. Nothing, just silence. And then, so soft I almost missed it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the bottom of the stairs. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away like it might fly open on its own. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the bat. I stood there, waiting, listening, but the tapping didn't come again. For a moment, I thought that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that maybe I was just so sleep-deprived and paranoid that my brain had started playing tricks on me. But when I turned to go back to my room, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a handprint on the basement door. It was faint, like someone had pressed their palm against the wood just hard enough to leave a greasy imprint. And here's the thing, it was way too small to be mine. It wasn't Mason's either, and it definitely wasn't Emily's. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat on my bed with the bat across my lap, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But the house stayed quiet after that. Too quiet. The next morning, I texted Mason and Emily, telling them what had happened. Mason tried to play it off, saying it was probably just a coincidence, or that I was imagining things. But Emily wasn't buying it. "I think we woke something up," she texted back. Mason tried to make a joke about it. Something about how we were being haunted by a ghost named Alec, which wasn't exactly the scariest name, but I could tell he was nervous too. None of us said it out loud, but we were all thinking the same thing. We shouldn't have asked about the basement. For the next few days, things were weird. The house felt different, like it wasn't really mine anymore. I started hearing strange noises at odd hours, soft footsteps on the stairs, faint whispering just on the edge of hearing. Once, I came home from work to find every light in the house turned on, even though I was sure I'd turned them all off before leaving. But the worst part was the basement door. No matter how many times I locked it, I kept finding it cracked open, just a little. Like someone, or something, was checking to see if it was safe to come out. I even tried stacking a chair in front of it one night, just to make sure it stayed shut. When I woke up the next morning, the chair had been moved to the other side of the room. Mason and Emily both told me to just leave it alone, to not mess with it any more than we already had. But it was getting harder and harder to ignore. Something was in the basement. I could feel it. and it was only a matter of time before it came out. That's when I made the worst decision of my life. I decided to go down there. I know how stupid it sounds. I knew going down there was a terrible idea, but at some point, curiosity overtook fear. Or maybe it wasn't even curiosity, really. It felt more like pressure, like the house was daring me to do it. Every time I walked past the basement door, it was cracked open just enough to make me feel like something on the other side was waiting for me to come down. The morning I decided to do it, Mason texted me, asking if everything was still weird. I didn't tell him what I was planning. I knew if I did, he'd just try to talk me out of it, and part of me wanted to believe I could make it all stop if I just confronted whatever was down there. I told myself I'd be quick, go down, take a look around, prove to myself that there was nothing there, and move on with my life. Simple, right? It wasn't. I grabbed a flashlight, even though there was a light bulb down there. That thing flickered so much it was practically useless, and if it went out while I was down there, well, I didn't want to be trapped in the dark. I took a deep breath, unlocked the basement door, and pulled it open. The air hit me like a slap to the face. It was cold, way colder than it should have been, and it smelled wrong. Stale, like wet concrete, and something sour, like spoiled meat that had been sitting out too long. I stood at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand, trying to work up the nerve to take the first step down. The stairs groaned under my weight, loud and slow, as if they hadn't been used in years. With every step, the air grew colder, thicker, like I was walking into a different world entirely. The flashlight beam bounced off the bare cement walls, casting long shadows that seemed to slither along the floor whenever I moved. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not just ordinary quiet, it was too quiet. No hum from the fridge upstairs, no wind rattling the windows, no distant sounds of cars outside, just this heavy, oppressive silence that made it hard to breathe. The only thing down there was a small stack of storage bins shoved against the far wall. Just junk I hadn't touched in months. Old clothes, broken lamps, stuff like that. But even though everything looked normal, I could feel it. Something was down there with me. I scanned the room with the flashlight, trying to ignore the way my hands were shaking. The light flickered once, and my heart nearly stopped. But when it came back on, nothing had changed. Just the same cold, empty basement. Then I noticed something strange. The concrete floor near the far wall wasn't quite level. It sloped down ever so slightly, like it had been worn away somehow. And at the base of the wall, where the floor dipped the most, I saw a small, dark stain. I knelt down to get a closer look, shining the flashlight on the spot. It looked like water, or at least, that's what I told myself at first. But as I leaned in, I saw that it wasn't water. It was sticky, with a weird brownish red tint. Blood. I jerked back so fast I almost dropped the flashlight. My pulse was racing now, and every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. But as I scrambled to my feet, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind the wall. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking just hard enough to be heard, but not hard enough to break through. I backed away, flashlight beam darting across the room, trying to find the source. And that's when I noticed it. A small crack in the wall, right above the stain. The crack was thin, no wider than a pencil, but it ran from the floor all the way to the ceiling. It looked almost like the wall had been patched over at some point, like someone had sealed something inside. The tapping stopped. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, staring at that crack, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the silence stretched on, and the only sound I could hear was my own breathing, sharp and uneven. And then, right before I turned to leave, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear as day, coming from somewhere deep within the wall. A voice, low and raspy. like it hadn't been used in years. It said, "Let me out." I bolted up the stairs so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, and shoved a chair in front of it for good measure. My whole body was shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. For a few minutes, I just stood there, trying to convince myself I hadn't heard what I thought I'd heard. But the words kept echoing in my mind, over and over. "Let me out. Let me out." I grabbed my phone and texted Mason, my fingers trembling so bad I could barely type. Me. "Dude, I went down there. There's something behind the wall." He responded almost instantly. Mason. "What do you mean, something?" Me. "I heard it. It spoke to me." There was a long pause before his next message came through. "Mason, get out of the house." Now I stared at the message, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to listen to him, to grab my keys, get in my car, and drive as far away as I could. But the other part of me knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just in the basement, it was in the house. And it wasn't going to let me go that easily. I stood there, frozen in place, listening to the silence around me. For a moment, everything was still. And then, slowly, the chair in front of the basement door began to move. It didn't fall over or slide across the floor. It just nudged forward, inch by inch, as if someone on the other side was gently pushing it aside. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the house, slamming the front door behind me. As I ran to my car, I glanced back at the house one last time, and that's when I saw it. The basement window, which had been sealed shut since I moved in, was now wide open. And I swear, just for a second, I saw a shadow move behind the glass. I didn't go back to the house that night. I drove aimlessly, just trying to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight they hurt, but I couldn't stop shaking. Every shadow along the road looked too tall, too human. Every flicker of light felt like something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I ended up parking in a grocery store lot, sitting in my car under the harsh fluorescent lights. I kept the engine running, afraid that if I turned it off, something might crawl out of the dark and find me. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Mason. Mason, where are you? Me. I left. Couldn't stay there. I stared at the screen, debating if I should tell him everything. Tell him about the crack in the wall, the tapping, the whisper. But before I could type out a response, another message came through. Mason, I think we messed up. That was not what I wanted to hear. I called him immediately, and he answered on the first ring. You left? He asked, his voice low and shaky, like he was scared someone might overhear him. Yeah, I said, running a hand through my hair. Mason, something's in the house. I heard it. It was talking to me. There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear him breathing heavily. I did some reading, he said finally, about Ouija boards, about basements, about... He stopped himself. It's not just some ghost. This thing, whatever it is, it's been waiting down there. For years, maybe longer. And when we used the board, we gave it permission. Permission to what? I asked, my stomach twisting into a knot. To leave. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My mind flashed back to the moment we asked the Ouija board about the basement. Don't go down, it had said. And then, go back. It wasn't warning us about something dangerous in the basement. It was warning us not to let it out. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, trying to keep myself from spiraling. So what do we do now? I whispered, though I already knew there wasn't going to be a good answer. I don't know, Mason admitted. Just stay somewhere else tonight. Get a hotel or something. We'll figure it out in the morning. I hung up without saying goodbye. My hands were still shaking and my heart was pounding in my chest like a drum. I knew I wasn't going back to the house. Not tonight, maybe not ever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't going to be that simple. And I was right. I spent that night in a cheap motel just off the highway, one of those places where the room smells like bleach and cigarettes. The The clerk barely looked at me as I checked in. I locked the door behind me and pushed the dresser in front of it, just in case. For a little while, it almost felt safe. The bed was lumpy, the heater rattled every few minutes, and the TV only had 2 channels that actually worked. But at least I wasn't in that house. At least I wasn't near the basement. I kept the lights on, too scared to sit in the dark. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of something tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I shot up in bed, heart racing, and looked around the room. The tapping was soft, coming from the door. Someone, or something, was on the other side. For a second, I told myself it was just a housekeeper, or someone who'd accidentally knocked on the wrong room. But deep down, I knew better. The tapping came again, slower this time, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My eyes stayed locked on the door, waiting for the knob to turn, for something to push its way inside. But it didn't. It just stood there, tapping. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard the same low, raspy whisper I'd heard in the basement. "Let me in." I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I checked the lock 3 times, my hands trembling so bad I could barely grip the latch. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, listening to the tapping, waiting for it to get louder, for the door to fly open. But then, just like before, the sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Every muscle in my body wound tight. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. And then, just when I thought it was over, I heard it again, this time coming from inside the room. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the bathroom. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab my keys, throw open the door and never look back. But I couldn't move. It was like my legs had turned to stone, like the weight of the air in the room was pinning me in place. Slowly, I turned toward the bathroom door. It was cracked open just a sliver, the way the basement door had been. Just enough for me to see the darkness on the other side. The tapping continued, soft and steady. I knew I shouldn't open that door. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to leave before it was too late. But I had to know. I took a step toward the door, then another. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I reached out, hands shaking, and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty. The light flickered once, casting jagged shadows across the walls. But there was no one there. No one tapping on the walls. No one waiting in the dark. Just a dirty sink, a stained shower curtain, and an old mirror hanging crooked on the wall. I stood there, breathless, staring at my own reflection. For a moment, everything was still. And then, in the mirror, something moved. It wasn't me. Something shifted just behind my reflection. A shadow, dark and formless, slithering along the edge of the glass. My heart stopped as I watched it crawl up the walls of the mirror, twisting and writhing until it took shape. A face, pale, gaunt, with sunken black eyes and a mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. It leaned closer, pressing its face against the inside of the mirror like it was trying to push its way through. And then, in that same low, rasping voice, it whispered, "Let me out." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and slammed the bathroom door shut. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold onto the handle. I knew then, without a doubt, that leaving the house hadn't mattered. It followed me. And no matter where I went, it was going to keep following me. I stood there, heart pounding, listening to the silence pressing in from all sides. Somewhere, deep inside, I knew it was only a matter of time. Sooner or later, it would find a way out. And when it did, I knew I wouldn't be able to stop it. I didn't stay in the motel after that. I couldn't. As soon as I slammed the bathroom door shut, I grabbed my keys, threw my stuff into a bag, and bolted. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to keep moving. I drove for hours, long after the sun came up, down highways and side roads, across towns I'd never been to before. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something sitting in the back seat, grinning at me from the shadows. But every time I looked, it was just me. That didn't make me feel any better. I ended up crashing on Mason's couch, too tired and too scared to be alone. When I got to his place, I didn't even explain much. He just took one look at me, sweat-soaked, eyes wide, trembling, and handed me a beer without a word. I told him everything that had happened, every little detail, from the tapping to the voice in the mirror. He didn't even make a joke about it this time. He just sat there, pale and silent, listening. When I was done, he looked down at his hands, twisting the beer bottle nervously. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "What if this thing... It's not just from the basement. What if it's attached to us now?" I felt my stomach turn. "What do you mean?" Mason hesitated, like he didn't want to say the next part out loud. "I think it's tied to us because of the Ouija board. We asked it questions, we gave it attention, and that's all it needed." I sat there, stunned, the weight of his words settling over me like a thick fog. We'd thought we were playing a stupid game, but in reality, we'd invited something into our lives, something that wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted, and I had no idea what that was. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Mason tried to distract me with movies and bad takeout, but it didn't help. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, made my skin crawl. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting. It was only a matter of time before it found a way back to me. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the coffee table. It was Emily calling me. I glanced at the time, 3:12 a.m. That was my first red flag. "Nothing good ever happens at 3 a.m., I answered, my voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Emily!" There was silence on the other end. Not static, not breathing, just complete, suffocating silence. I sat up, every hair on my body standing on end. "Emily? Are you there?" And then, through the silence, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold. The tapping wasn't coming from the phone, it was coming from outside Mason's front door. I jumped off the couch, heart slamming against my ribs, and grabbed Mason by the shoulder, shaking him awake. "Mason, someone's at the door," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell, dude? It's the middle of the..." The tapping came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Mason froze, the colour draining from his face. We stared at each other, neither of us wanting to say it. We both knew what it was. Without thinking, Mason grabbed a kitchen knife and gestured for me to stay behind him as we crept toward the door. My pulse pounded in my ears, every step feeling like a countdown to something I couldn't escape. We reached the door, and Mason pressed his ear against it, his hand tightening around the knife. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from the other side of the door, that same low, raspy voice whispered, "Let me in." Mason stumbled back, his face pale as a sheet. "What the hell, man? What the actual hell?" We both stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the doorknob began to rattle. The thing outside wasn't knocking anymore. It was trying to force its way in. "Don't open it," I whispered, as if Mason needed the warning. He didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the door, wide with terror, his hand trembling around the knife. And then the rattling stopped. We stood in complete silence, waiting, hearts pounding, for what felt like hours. And then, from just outside the door, came a new sound. Scratching. Soft, deliberate scratching, like nails dragging slowly across the wood. It wasn't trying to break in anymore. It was playing with us. That was the moment I knew, deep in my gut, that this thing wasn't going to stop. It didn't matter where I went or how far I ran, it would find me, because we'd opened the door once. and now it was just waiting for us to do it again. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the next knock, the next whisper, the next sign that it was still out there. But it never came. The sun rose. The world outside looked normal again, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I almost convinced myself that it was over. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. It was only waiting. 2 days later, Emily stopped responding to our texts. Her phone went straight to voicemail. No one had seen her at work. Mason and I both tried calling her over and over, but it was like she'd vanished off the face of the earth. We went to her apartment, hoping to find some explanation, some clue as to where she'd gone. But when we got there, her door was unlocked. Inside, everything was perfectly in place, nothing missing, nothing out of place, except for one thing: her Ouija board. It was sitting on the kitchen table, planchette placed neatly in the center, like someone had just finished using it. And written across the board, in jagged, uneven letters, was a single word: hello. I don't know what happened to Emily. I don't know where she went or what took her. But I do know one thing: it's not done with us. The tapping hasn't started again, yet. But I can feel it, creeping closer with every passing day, waiting for the right moment to knock. And when it does, I know it won't be asking for permission anymore. It'll be coming in, whether I like it or not. And this time, I won't be able to stop it.